In this occasional series we look at some construction projects to see what's going on. And we'll also try to understand some of the methods, techniques and sequences that are being carried out. Our first stop is a project known as 1 Lansdowne Road in the London Borough of Croydon. It will consist of 2 towers, with the tallest being 49 floors. From the renders we go to the current state of play, which is demolition of buildings on the site. The demolition is being carried out by the Enabling Works Specialists IRIF. Among the buildings soon to go is the old YMCA, and scaffolding is being erected for the demolition. Here is a render taken on Lansdowne Road with a view from approximately a similar position. The buildings being demolished are around 50 years old and are of reinforced concrete, and the equipment being used on site is heavy-duty hydraulic excavators. This Hitachi 350 has got a crusher attachment, and it can be used to crunch concrete and also to sort out material as it's doing here. A water spray is kept running to try and keep the dust down. Also on site is a larger machine, and this is a Komatsu high-reach demolition excavator. As the name suggests, it can reach high, and it's also got a crusher tool at the end. And a skilled operator with a machine like this enables demolition to be carried out in a controlled way, and that's obviously important in city centre work. The new buildings planned for this site are currently in the planning process, but there's plenty of demolition work to be getting on with before construction can start. The next site is 1 Leadenhall Street, and this is a 36-floor office building. Construction of it is well advanced, with the concrete core topped out and the steelwork approaching the top. Much of the cladding has also been installed, so the final look of the building is well advanced. One interesting technical aspect here is how one of the tower cranes has been installed on a temporary gantry. And that's an interesting solution where the footprint of a building occupies most of the site. Here's a different view of the crane on the gantry, and the likelihood is that this will be the last crane on the site. It will be used to disassemble the other tower cranes, and then it can use a climbing cage to lower itself down to ground level, where a mobile crane can take it to pieces. So here's a view looking at the top of the building. And let's have a closer look at what's going on. During steelwork erection, temporary bracing is used to keep it stable, and then this gets removed later. And you can see that steel decking is placed as the first step towards forming floors. A mat of steel reinforcing bars is then placed onto the decking. And then a concreting gang comes along and places the concrete, which is pumped up from street level. And if we look at the floor below, we can see the finished concrete surface. Moving on to the top of the building, you can see that there are currently 3 tower cranes installed, and these are all Terex luffing jib cranes. The right hand one is mounted on the top of the core, and the tallest one rises from a mid-level floor. And you can see here why having a crane inside the building is awkward, and that's because you've got to have a temporary hole in all of the floors. You can also see that the steel erectors use nice green cherry pickers, and they sit on yellow load spreaders to put the load on the steelwork and not the decking. The next site to look at is 1 Undershaft, and this is currently submitted for planning approval. At 74 floors, it will be the tallest building in the City of London. What's interesting about this site is that the existing building is a tall office block, and it's often known as St Helens Tower or the Aviva Tower. This impressive looking building was built in the late 1960s, and the demolition of it will be a technical challenge. And the reason is there are no columns at ground level, and that's because all of the floors hang from support structures at the middle and top of the building. The idea was to have office floors that didn't have big columns in them, but it did make the construction complex, and it will make the demolition complex. Right now the building is being emptied, and that could mean that demolition starts later in 2024. Also interesting is that the building sits on a much larger site, and the whole of it has underground basements. Nearby, another new building that's planned is 50 Fenchurch Street. And this is a 36-floor office development. Demolition of the existing buildings on the site is well underway, and the sheeted scaffolding is the sign of death. And the contractor for this stage of the works is Celtbray. One interesting aspect of the site is that it includes an old church tower, which is the Tower of All Hallows Staining, and it will get incorporated as a better setting within the new development. The old Clothworkers Hall has got some interesting scaffolding, with multiple ladder beams supporting the scaffold above. And here we have a view looking down on the demolition site. A tower crane is used to remove some of the materials and move the plant around. And the demolition method is conventional with a top-down sequence. Old-fashioned burning is being used to cut structural steel, and mini excavators and skid steer loaders are used to break up the floors and move material. Here we can see some steelwork beams being moved, and then drop down to a lower level. And then another machine comes along and picks them up and moves them again. Demolition work has been underway for quite a few months, but there's several more months to go before construction can start. Another new building in the city which has planning permission is 55 Bishopsgate. It's more offices and it's 63 floors in a distinctive design. The site is quite big and it currently has a large building on it, and it has not been vacated yet, so the start of demolition on this one looks like it's a few months away. Chapter London Bridge is a 39-storey tower, and it's being developed to provide student accommodation. Construction is well underway on this building with its distinctive facade, and the cranes aren't working because it was a windy day. Probably too much baked beans on toast for the drivers. The structure is interesting and complicated at street level, and because of the restricted footprint, both tower cranes have been put on temporary gantries. Here you can see the cladding framework being installed at the lower level, and the construction of the building is interesting because the cladding and flooring units have been prefabricated, and it's nice to see that even at this stage windows are being kept clean. Next door is a development known as The Edge, and this is a 27th floor office building. Construction is at an early stage and it's interesting and complex. Firstly, a board pile wall was installed around the edge of the site, and the main bearing piles in the centre had plunge columns installed. At this end, a big capping beam was installed around the edge for stability, and at the far end a permanent ground slab was cast. This saves on using temporary props, and also provides a firm logistics platform. The building has multiple basement levels, and in the centre one level of excavation has been carried out and the floor slab cast. Again, that saves on temporary propping, but it will also provide a platform for the slip-form core to go upwards. Ultimately, basement excavation will continue under this intermediate slab. But that does mean that the excavation is relatively slow and expensive, and at the far end there are machines under the top-down slab pushing material towards the small orange excavator. That then double handles it upwards so that the yellow excavator can load up, and then it has to track to the roadside in order to dump its load. Of course, a consequence of deep excavations like this is that you might release creatures that have never been seen before.